My background is ethical hacking, Splunk architecture. I actually got into technology about 10 years ago through network architecture. So I like networks more than I like people, or at least that's how it started. And actually through security, I learned to understand and enjoy people. My most successful achievement is I'm a ferret mom. Yes, those are my 3 ferrets. They're absolutely beautiful. And I did a Venn diagram to understand which ones you may want to cuddle, which ones you don't, because they like biting toes. And that's about it. Okay, so today we're going to take a little bit of a different approach than I traditionally do when it comes to talking about cybersecurity. It's not going to be a highly technical talk. It's actually going to talk about humans. Because what I've learned in my 10 or so odd years of experience is we build programs and solutions for humans, but then we actually forget the humans and it doesn't actually work for them. So we're going to try and reset that and approach it from a different point of view. So we're going to start with the brain, how it develops. We're going to talk about how we go from learning a skill to being skilled. We're going to talk about types of learning, our motivations and how to keep people motivated, and then building the holistic, meaning the overall program that actually incorporates everything. And then I'm actually going to touch on traumatic situations, only because it's actually really beneficial when it comes to building your incident response teams, is actually choosing the people that work in those situations, because there's nothing worse than having a brilliant team that's highly skilled that then has to deal with PTSD after the incident has occurred. So keeping that in mind. So my talk I developed through... I've done a bit of research in the last year on how we function, how we develop, and how our brain works, mainly because I wanted to get to know myself and understand why I am the way I am. David Eagleman created a brilliant book called The Brain. So a lot of the content that I'm bringing up today is from that book. And his quote was, as you can read it, basically, your brain... the way it develops is the synapses, or the connections, are strengthened through repeated connections. So as you do it, it's continuously strengthening those synapses. And so actually, the way you are is based on what you're not doing, because that's what's getting removed from your brain. So the way the brain develops, when you're born, you're actually born with a very simple lacking of connections in your brain. And I always thought growing up that horses and that must be more intelligent than humans because they're born and then they can walk right away, whereas we're quite pathetic for quite a few years. And the truth actually is they're pre-connected, and so they actually have a limited capability to grow, versus us, which are born with a very boring lack of connection brain, gives us more opportunities to grow and change and create different solutions for different scenarios. Basically, it makes us different based on our experiences. And then at 2 years old, that's actually the peak. So you have an exceptional amount of synapses, so that's connections. See, it's up to, I think, 100 trillion is what he said in the book. And that means actually, then you're going to start scaling back. And by the time you're an adult, you actually have 50% less that are paired off. Again, how it's strengthened is repeating. How it's weakened is, and then eventually removed, is you're not doing it. So, for example, my computer just blue screened. That's brilliant! Somebody want to troubleshoot this for me? So, I'm going to talk without slides. I'll give you the slides after on Twitter. But basically, the way this is not going to work, but that's okay. The way our brain works is as we repeat something, connections are strengthened. As we don't do it, they're weakened. And so that's why we all have different skills. When people tell me, users are stupid, they're not doing something, or they don't understand something, the reality is, it's because they haven't repeated that thing over and over again to create that connection. I'm going to use my phone for my slides so I know where I am. Give me 1 second. Apologies.
Quick look.
Yeah, I don't know. Doesn't like me. That's brilliant. I've actually never had my computer blue screen at an event. That's amazing. It's my work computer too. I'm going to complain. Just kidding. Where am I? You know what? I promise I have actually quite cool slides. Come on. I won't open it. Yeah, we'll see. I don't know. I should probably remember my password.
It's always like the first step. The problem with having passwords is
Is that right? Oh, it looks like it's right. Okay. Conferences. BSides. Oh, here we go. I've got slides in my notebook. So, before I continue, I'm just going to say that I actually brought prizes if you ask me questions, so you kind of have to pay attention, because the prizes are kind of cute. I know. I like them. Hey. I don't know if that's going to work. So, I have a pretty slide for it to show you in a minute, but basically, when you're learning a skill, your brain is in something called the beta wavelength frequency. And then when you're skilled, it's in the alpha. And the difference there is the beta wavelength means your brain is constantly troubleshooting, it's expanding a lot of energy, and it's trying to manually think through each step. That looks good. Versus in the alpha wavelength frequency, your brain's actually at rest. And so think of it as when you're... I keep pressing buttons. Think of it as when you're learning a skill, it's really challenging, it's really tiring, and you feel kind of clunky, if that makes sense. So I've recently picked up something called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm absolutely terrible, but it's a lot of fun. It's like aggressive cuddling. You end up with a lot of bruises. But when I started, I'm still shit, but I was really slow, and everything I was doing felt like, when I say I started, I mean 2nd of January, so I'm really experienced at this point. But I would do something and it'd be really slow, versus my partner, he's a black belt, and he'd do it and he'd make it look really easy, and I'd just get really angry at him mainly. But it's because I'm thinking in the beta wavelength. I'm manually thinking of each step. I'm counting, okay, this, now this, now this, now this. Versus him, it's actually in his subconscious, and he's not actually thinking about it. And so he's at rest, he's very relaxed, and he can do something without thinking, and that actually opens more opportunities for them, which is why when you come to cybersecurity and you're training people, they get really frustrated or they're really tired at the end of the day because they've been thinking about every single step that they have to walk through. Versus you, it comes naturally. You don't even think about it. I think this is going to work now. And so one thing I like to remind people is when they are doing that. Is this going to work? Oh, what? Amazing. When they're teaching, you have to be patient with people and give them the time to actually develop that skill and slowly think about it and understand and make those connections, versus just being like, okay, drop you in the deep end, just know how to do this and do it within a certain amount of time. And if you don't do it properly, you're going to be punished, because that's just going to create a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress and a lot of, actually, we're going to do it our way and find ways around your solution. So again, when you're learning, think of it as a software-based process. Your brain is making these connections and strengthening them, but there's nothing hard-coded in yet. Versus when you're skilled at something, it's actually a physical change in your brain. And it's almost like it's the hardware. So it's working without you thinking, it's in your subconscious brain, and it's a lot quicker. In the learning, you're using your prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, cerebellum. The cerebellum is, it's basically the flow of movement, accuracy, and perfect timing. If you're manually thinking through all of this and using these, it expends, again, like I said, a lot of energy. Versus in the hardware, it's actually below your subconscious, and it can be so hard-coded in that it actually is making the decisions in your spinal cord. They unfortunately did an experiment, I don't know when, years ago, where these cats had a massive amount of their brain removed, but they still knew how to walk. And that's because it wasn't actually their brain that was doing the thinking about walking, it was their spinal cord. Think of when you're walking upstairs and you're talking, you're not thinking about each and every step, each and every movement to get up the stairs. You're not thinking about how your tongue is working. You're not thinking about how your lips are working. You're just doing it. And then the last thing I wanted to mention on this side was a lot of times when I go into an organization, people that are maybe from the older generation, or maybe they've been doing what they do for a very long time. They say, you know what, I'm too old to learn something new. I don't know how to do this. I don't understand it. Then you can refer them to London taxi drivers. And London taxi drivers, if you don't know, they have to memorize an exceptional amount of routes in London, like common attractions where tourists may want to go to. And they're learning that as an adult. And in their brain, it's actually physically changing their something called the hippocampus, which is for your memory and it's your spatial memory part of your brain. It actually physically grows in size. So that's an exceptional talent, if you ask me, because I'm shit at remembering things. But the fact that they can actually do that as they're older, as their brain has already fully developed, means that somebody learning how to create a secure password or use a VPN service, for example, it is possible for them to do it. You just have to support them in that process. Types of learning. See, I like this because I am not a traditional way of learning. I pick up things that I really like, and I mimic people, or I do this or do that, and I learn random skills. And so, in my opinion, I don't feel like I'm overall really skilled, but I've got a lot of random things I'm good at, and it's because without realizing, I'll pick up these different things, depending on my motivation, and then I'll actually memorize certain random processes, if that makes sense. But anyway, classical conditioning. This is what you think of in training. So you think stimuli 1 and stimuli 2 create a relationship, and so actually at the end of it, because it's such a strong relationship, you can do stimuli 2, which will actually produce stimuli 1. Think of Pavlov's dog, if that makes sense. So he would feed them and make a bell sound, and so the food is stimuli 1, the bell is stimuli 2, and then he would ring a bell, and their saliva glands would start to produce extra saliva because it's in their brain, it's made that connection that bell means food. I'm not saying train your employees that way, but I mean, you could, people like food, but that's one way that we learn. Another one is operant conditioning. So this one to me I thought was quite interesting because it's actually talking about positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment, which in my mind punishment sounds negative, but actually isn't necessarily. So again, it's the association between behavior and consequences. So positive reinforcement, for example, is when a favorable outcome, event, or reward occurs after an action. Think of, for anyone that has children or maybe younger siblings and they were going to learning how to be potty trained. I know when I taught children how to be potty trained, I give them a little gold star sticker because I love stars and I love stickers. And in my mind, that makes sense. But every time they would go wee in the toilet, they'd get a star. And that was really exciting. So they'd be really excited and start bragging about going to the washroom, which is interesting, but they get a star. Think of providing a treat for a dog that's done a trick. So after you have associated that, you say roll over, they roll over because they know that that's going to give them a treat. Negative reinforcement is actually strengthened by stopping, removing, or avoiding a negative outcome or adverse stimulus. Think of when you are teaching a child, again, potty training, because that's an easy example. You know, they were going to wash their hands are wet. How do they dry it? So you say, okay, wash your hands are wet. You give them the towel, they rub their hands in the towel, and then they have dry hands. I don't like having wet hands, so that to me is a negative stimuli, and that's removing it. So in the future, when they have wet hands for any other reason, they'll actually rub them, because that is that association to that's going to remove the water. Think of crying when you don't want to do something. Maybe I'm like really angry at you and I cry, that you'll probably leave me alone. So in theory, that's a way of associating, oh, well, I don't want to talk to you, or maybe I don't want to eat mushy peas. So, I mean, that makes more sense for children, but maybe I'm really emotional. And so that stimuli will then be removed, and then I can be happy again. Now thinking of punishment. So positive punishment is adding something unpleasant. So I don't know if we're allowed to spank children anymore, but that's an example. Or think of when somebody commits a crime, they get a prison sentence. Maybe it's, I don't know. Or they get a sentence, necessarily prison. So maybe they get a fine or something. And so they're adding in a negative punishment. The positive is actually not being positive in happy, positive in adding. The negative punishment is actually taking something away that's negative, such as you're in jail, but you have really positive behavior, you're being really helpful or something, they'll reduce your sentence. Sorry, I'm a bit sick. And then observational learning, that is where you view an action, you store it in your memory, and then you mimic it. And the reason you continue mimicking it is because after you've done it, it becomes a positive outcome for you. So think back to my adventures with jiu-jitsu. I watch the instructor present something to us. I store it in my memory, and then I mimic it on the person that I'm rolling with. And if it's successful, I'll then continue mimicking it later on when I'm doing more sparring. Personal experiences, I think the guy tripping is a brilliant icon for that, because it's how we perceive and react to the world. Think of a situation that you've been in where it's had a negative outcome or it has a positive outcome, and you've either repeated or removed that action. Sorry. Now I'm going to talk about motivations quickly, and then we'll actually get into the fun stuff of what the whole point of this talk is, but let me just do that. So intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. So how are you motivated? Think of when you want to do something, why do you do it? There's something called extrinsic, which is an external thing that's making you want to do something, like the example, I think that's supposed to be money, so maybe you'll get a reward for providing information, or maybe it's you'll be punished for not doing something, such as, you know, falling victim to a phishing campaign. Maybe you get punished for that, or maybe you forget to enter your timesheet and you work for one of those big fours that announce that if you don't enter your timesheet, you get docked £100. That's quite negative, so you probably enter your time on time. Or one company I worked for, if I sent a name to them and they ended up actually hiring that person, I would be paid quite a large amount. So I'll likely add a lot of names so that they don't have to go through recruiters. Intrinsic motivation is, as you can imagine, internal. This is feeling a part of something bigger, feeling like you're making a difference in the world. It's what's motivating you inside. I speak at and do talks on domestic abuse and violence, helping the victims and survivors of abuse. I'm intrinsically motivated because I've been that survivor, I've been in that situation, and I want to make a difference in the world. And so Generally, I don't get paid for those talks, but I still am motivated to do it because for me, it's a big part of my life. Extrinsically, if I was paid, awesome, but that's not actually what's going to motivate me in the long term. So, how did we get here in the world of technology that is more of a fail by design than security by design? So now we're going into actually what the point of this talk is and why we talked about motivations, learning types, and how our brain works. You probably know all this as of what you guys do in your field, but when I do this talk at more corporate events, the C-suites are like, oh, that makes so much sense. Why didn't we think of that? And the thing is, when we buy technology, when we buy software, when we buy hardware, we generally want to spend under a certain amount, or, within our budget, but we want the best and the newest and the most exciting. Well, that kind of motivates the organizations to say, okay, well, we need something quick to market that is affordable and everybody likes to buy. Which actually leads to a forgetting or not incorporating maybe security controls, reviews, validations throughout the development process. And so that it's like the quick to market, cheap to market, and then we have these failure by design technology, IoT that is more successful as a botnet than a camera. The reason I bring that up is, in my mind, the future is actually moving to a situation where you have two outcomes. You have the organizations that care for their users, and when they're breached, for example, it's okay because they put the mitigations in place, and the users, whilst they may be still impacted, it's not as exceptional as something like Equifax. And then you have the second situation where when an organization is breached, they didn't put any controls in place, and hello, Equifax. And that's going to make a huge difference in our world because if you're a British citizen, you might not understand, but I bring up Equifax because in the US and Canada, I'm Canadian, I don't sound it, but if my social insurance number is taken, or in the US I think it's social security number, my life can be ruined. There's children in the US that are bankrupt and they're not old enough to take out a credit card, for example. And it's because their family had that number, that social insurance number, or their friends or somebody had that number and was able to take out credit in their name before they were able to walk, for example. And so in that situation, when that company was breached for the people that, are older, that ruins their lives. So if you look at my future image of the world, if Equifax had put those controls in place and maybe prioritized that data effectively, those people wouldn't be as impacted. Versus the controls weren't in place, and that's changed their life for quite a negative situation. That's kind of how I see your responsibility as the techs in industry. And the reason I say that is because you're the person at the front lines that maybe you're developers or your network architects or your, whatever else there is out there, other things that I'm not skilled in. You're the one that has the ability to say, wait, this isn't right. We can make this change. It's simple. Let's start from the beginning. Let's make a change in the architectural design before it goes to production. Because think of the very first vehicle. I think it was Ford. They built a car. They realized after mass production that people die really easily when they get hit. Ford was like, or it might not have been Ford. I might be saying wrong company, so don't quote me on that. But it's actually cheaper for us to pay the lawsuits of the people's horrendous deaths than it is to change. It's just like our software and our hardware. If you don't start from the beginning, it actually can be cheaper to just deal with the consequences than it is to change it. So it's actually your job to then incorporate security by design and the culture and awareness from the beginning. So that's why I think this is a very important topic. Creating a holistic program in 3 steps. What time is it? How much time do I have? Yeah? Lovely. Okay.
It's 10:15, it's already done.
Perfect.
Wait, you can't.
Yeah, fair enough. So step 1, have the right people. Step 2 is speak the same language. And step 3 is maintain your program. So, step 1, have the right people. I attended I guess I spoke at a conference last year, I believe. And I think she was the keynote. This lady, I can't remember her name, but I wrote a blog post on her, so ask me after. But she said, we need to stop hiring in our own image. I'm guilty of that. I think network architects are brilliant. I think people that care about the network, awesome. Developers are cool, but network architects, they're brilliant. That's really unfair and can lead to a really, really, really insecure environment because I understand bits of the architecture. I understand the physical layer. Not so great at the other layers because I prioritize my things accordingly. When I hire in my own image, I will look at people that focus on that. Maybe not so much on things I think are boring. And I become very focused on one thing and forget everything around me, which, as you can imagine, is not very secure. Diversity in skill sets, in points of view, in culture, that's going to make us more secure. So hiring the right people is meaning not just gender, although, that's important, hiring people that are male, female, and non-binary, that's going to make a difference because they're going to have a different point of view as well. But also hiring somebody with a different skill, or a different point of view, different life experiences, going back to how we learn. Our brain is physically different from each other. And so having that layered approach, not just in our technology, but also in our humans, going to make a difference. When I started, I had this short-term project years and years ago at a software development company. I'm not a developer. I don't know how to do that. To me, it's magic. But they hired me because I was in the interview and they're like, okay, here's your really, really, really challenging technical questions. Say you're in a situation where your switch dies. It's like, okay. And they're like, and you only have 2 switches to replace it, but they're small, so you have to use both of them. And I was like, oh, okay, so do you have the configuration backed up? Do you have spanning tree protocol turned on? And they just looked at me and their eyes were like, glossed up, and they were like, that's the solution. That took us 3 bloody days to solve that. That was my technical question. And it wasn't because they weren't intelligent. They built this amazing software. They could do things that I could not even imagine, without even thinking, without even Googling. I mean, talk about skill. But it's because that's what they understood. They didn't understand the physical layer, and they hired me to fill that gap. And in my opinion, that was a really simple technical question, but it took, as I said, 3 days for them to solve. It's not, again, because I was magical. I was quite new to industry, but I had a different point of view, different experience, a different talent. As well, hiring the right people is awesome. Maybe you hire a diverse team, you hire diverse skills, you hire, really cool, exciting people. But you don't support them at all and they leave. That's not having the right people. You need to invest in your talent. So maybe you're a team lead and you have the ability to tell your senior leadership, we need to pay for this amount of training. We need to invest in this person in this skill and this person in that skill. Because that's going to make a difference, because they're going to want to continue staying with you because, again, you're extrinsically motivating them in the sense that, you got to pay them properly, but also intrinsically motivating them in the sense that they feel like they're making a difference and they're learning and they have a sense of mastery. Think of gamification principles. One of those things is mastery, and it's you're learning a skill and you're getting really good at it, and that's a great way to motivate people and a great way to retain your talent. Speak the same language. This I feel like you probably run into a lot. I know I did, especially when I started. I still do, and I get annoyed, but it's really simple. When I look at solutions, I say, this is the solution. I looked at the budget. I looked at the, key points for success at this organization. I looked at our challenges. this is my solution. But I don't give them that whole background. I just say, this is a solution, give me money. And they say, no. And it's because I'm not speaking their language. I'm not saying, this is my risk-based approach. This is how I approached it. This is my evidence. And this is why you should trust me to give me a heck of a lot of money. This is why I view the budget as 2 million versus 1 million. And you view it as 500. You have to speak the language that they understand. You can't expect your senior leadership, if they're not technical, to understand the technical requirements. You can't expect them to trust you right off the bat. You have to look at it from their point of view. You have to provide them with your background, because as you build that trust, they're not going to have to see as much evidence over time, which is fine, but they'll be more confident when they're making their decisions. But you also have to think of it from a risk point of view, because, as you see in the bottom, one of my colleagues created this slide. It's beautiful. Not my typical slide, because it makes more sense. But he said that a lot of executives say, are we secure? And there's no tech in the right mind that would be like, yeah, totally. We're totally secure. Because no, you're not. You never will be. There's no such thing as perfect security. It's just not that simple. It's, well, I mean, kind of secure. But if you say that to an exec, they're going to be like, well, I mean, you don't really need that money. And so you have to find a solution that's going to work for the execs, work for the users, and actually, allow you to sleep at night. Step 3 for maintaining your program. It's all fine and dandy if you create a solution that has proper metrics. It has a baseline. It has a solution that actually works for the organization. And then you send it to the people and then you walk away. Because that's not going to be maintained, and that's actually not ultimately going to be successful. And then it's going to make you look a bit foolish because you're like, oh, I've got the best solution. And then 6 months down the line, it doesn't solve anything, and you end up where your company has received a phishing email, fall victim to the phishing email, and not investigated for 2 months. I've been in that environment. I've seen what it does to an organization, and I've had to help them afterwards. And they're like, we invested so much money. Our budget went from here to here, and it keeps going up, and I don't know why it's happening. And it's simply because they weren't maintaining it. They weren't maintaining their skill of their employees, their technical controls. They were spending a lot of money on this fancy, sexy hardware that worked at about 20% of its requirement. And they didn't actually know if it was working because they weren't actually monitoring the performance or the success and failures. So whenever you add a solution, or you build a awareness program for your company, you build a program that works with the controls and the people and everything brilliant, you have to actually seek assurance. What you're doing, is it done correctly? Is it actually aligning with what success means to both the techs and the high-ups that maybe aren't necessarily as technical? And is the training you're providing, is that actually addressing the human behaviors that we need to change, and is it motivating them to continue? Again, the monitoring performance, build proper metrics, actually baseline your organization, because how are you going to know if you're succeeding is if you have no idea where you're at? And then continuously improve. The goal is actually to just get 1% better every day. You don't have to have the best solution. You don't have to have the sexiest tools or the coolest people. I mean, obviously you guys are the coolest people, but you just have to continue trying to be better than you were yesterday. Culture of security. So this is basically what I just talked through. And I think it looks simple, but I think a lot of people forget how simple it is. So the first step in I actually have this listed really nicely in the next slide, but basically, what does success look like to you as a tech? What does success look like to your business, and what does success look like to the execs that maybe aren't as technical or aren't focused on security? And you line that all up, and then you build your solution around that, and you monitor it, and you build the metrics in, and then you raise awareness. Because if you try and focus on raising awareness first and don't actually know what success is, you probably won't get anywhere. And if you do, you won't actually know. And your budget won't continue being funded because nobody knows if you're succeeding or not. Again, raise awareness, do different channels, create creative content. Don't shame people, because if you want people to shut down and not focus, tell them that they're stupid, tell them, do fear-mongering, tell them that they're not going to succeed, and instead of using the social proof in a positive way of being like, oh, 90% of you failed my phishing campaign, because that, in their mind, that's going to say, well, they failed, so I'll probably fail too. Versus saying 10% of you succeeded in catching my phishing email. 10% of you actually knew what to look for. Because then in their mind they'll be like, bloody hell, that person's not that smart, I could do it. And, oh, you know what, I can succeed because that person succeeded. And it's actually, think of it as using social engineering in a positive light to convince your people to actually care and understand and grow. Influence behavior. A big problem I have with organizations is they say, you have to do this and this and this. And then I go and do a password cracking exercise and realize the security team are using password 1 as their password. You laugh, but I've actually seen that on highly sensitive systems. You need to influence behaviors by being the example. So think back to the different types of learning types. Yeah, that makes sense. The one in the top right, I can't remember what it's called, but basically that one's the seeing and mimicking, and the continuous motivation to mimic that is because that person you respect and it leads positively to your environment. If you're like, oh, don't use shit passwords, but I'm going to use password 1 because I'm lazy, you're not going to probably have very secure other people, because they're going to see that and be like, well, you do it, so why do I need to? Change habits. When we have a habit, it takes, I think it's 2 weeks to change that. And the minute you fail at changing it, it goes back to the way it was before. I think, for me, I, as I said, started jiu-jitsu because of a person in this audience's fault. It's brilliant, but sorry. It takes effort for me to remember to actually go to class and build into my habit to eat healthy and eat on time and actually wash my gi to actually get to class. And I have to consciously work at that until it becomes routine for me. I'm motivated to do it because apparently I like pain, but if it's something that I don't necessarily like, it's even harder to motivate them. Going into security in your environment, if you're like, okay, make this change now, they're going to be like, no. And it's not going to be habit for them. They're going to find ways around it, and they're not going to be motivated, and it's going to be really, 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 really hard to change that behavior. If you encourage it by, again, focusing on types of learning, focusing on motivations, and actually encouraging and supporting it by saying things like, if you attend a day of training, maybe the next day you have a lighter schedule because that's a lot of energy being expanded. Or if you're going to training that day, maybe you don't have to be on call that evening, supporting them to actually be able to make that change. And then in the end, you just magically end up with this secure culture. Again, this is something that you continuously need to work on. I've found a lot of organizations that invest a ton of money into their secure culture, into their holistic program, and then they kind of just leave it to do its own thing and expect it to stay. Think of culture of an organization. You have these people that think alike, and as you grow, you hire that one person that's completely different, and maybe they're really negative, for example. That can change your entire culture. So if you're not encouraging it through everyone and through every single part of your business and, incorporating privacy and security by design throughout everything, your culture is not going to be supported in that, and it won't be maintained. Again, this is basically what I went through. I made sure to change the colouring because the first time it looked like something really inappropriate. But so now we have blue and purple. But again, starting off, I'm going to keep repeating this because you have to actually say something 5 times before somebody learns it. Define success for your organisation. Build effective metrics. Focus that syllabus, baseline, incorporate motivations and learning types. And the last thing is definitely build an intuitive dashboard, because your execs are going to be like, are you succeeding? And you're going to be like, I think so. And they're going to be like, well, you probably don't need that money. What you could do actually is have this dashboard that works for the techs, so they can see all of the breakdown of anything from, for example, you're running a phishing campaign and you're monitoring things like people that fall victim, but also people that fall victim and report it, because in my mind, that's a success. Or people that fall victim and don't ever report it, because that is a huge failure. Or people that fall victim and continuously fall victim. Like, those are metrics that you need to continuously monitor and put on the dashboard for the techs so that they can kind of incorporate that into their training. Versus, the execs, they're not going to want to see those stats. So you want something a bit simplified and pretty graphs and stuff that they actually care about. And, monitor culture and behavior and all that fun stuff. So last thing I'm going to touch on is traumatic situations. And the reason I'm going to touch on this is because back in the beginning of my title, it says professional stalker. So the reason I say that is because I've done intelligence work. It's bloody brilliant. It's so much fun to stalk people. Who knew? And get paid for it. But it can lead to some really negative in situations. Incident response, highly, highly stressful. Spur of the moment, usually fucking 3 a.m. on Christmas Day or something, you have to deal with it. Sorry, I'm not supposed to swear. But you have to have people that can actually grow from that and be able to handle that kind of stress. I was in a situation where, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a survivor of domestic abuse and sexual assault. And I had to do an investigation of a rape victim. And it wasn't an investigation to support this rape victim. It was an investigation against her. And I can't do that. I can't, because I've been that person. And so for me, that is not something that I can do. So if I'm ever in that situation, I have to hand it off to someone. And the only reason that I'm able to do that is because my bosses or managers or whatever, they know that about me, and they know that they either won't give me that content or they'll support me when I say I can't do this, and they'll hand it to someone else. I've investigated possible suicides. I've had friends, I've not had to, but I've had friends that have investigated child abuse and, not pornography, but what's the word? Exploitation. And for them, they can handle that. It sucks, but they can handle it. They're able to. I probably wouldn't be able to do that. Children and animals, abuse against them, I can't handle. But I can handle, people hurting each other. I don't know why. I'm kind of weird. But what I'm saying is, you need to know your people. You need to know what environment you're in, because it's all fine and dandy to train them. But if they end up with post-traumatic stress disorder from their work, you're not going to have a successful team. You're not going to have a successful environment. And you're probably going to get people leaving. And you're probably going to, you could actually cause damage to those people's lives. Think of social media sites that are like, oh, it's okay. We don't need to care about algorithms. We'll have physical people monitoring all these posts to make sure that they're okay. Well, those people are going to have to deal with that stress and that trauma after. So when you build your incident response team, when you build your people with highly stressful jobs, you have to consider, are they somebody that can grow from that environment, or are they somebody that actually can be negatively impacted for the rest of their lives? Because PTSD is hard. I was diagnosed with that in 2013, and 2 different types. So based on an abuse I was in domestic abuse, but I also had abuse as a child. And the first one I can deal with and get through. The second one, I've had to receive treatment on building relationships and how I can actually function and connect with people, because I couldn't actually do that, especially not healthily. And it's a long-term thing. It's not something that just goes away. And in a work environment, you might think, oh, well, it's just work. It's not a big deal. But it is, because it's a huge part of your life. So if you're actually causing problems to your employees in the long term, you're doing it wrong. So again, post-traumatic growth, great. It's positive. It's stressful and traumatic, yeah, but you can actually grow from it. I've learned and developed new skills. I did a talk last year in Sri Lanka for young people getting into security. And one thing I mentioned was the skills I learned for ethical hacking, for stalking, that actually I learned through my life experiences, like operational security. I learned from being in a controlling relationship. I learned, that point of view, these different methods, and I grew from that trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder is very negative, as you can imagine. It doesn't sound positive, and you actually kind of go backwards. It's possible to have both reactions. So building your incident response, building your teams, make sure to understand who they are and how to support them. And if they start going into the negative, support them further. If there's somebody that really, really does well in these kind of highly stressful environments, you still support them, but have them also support their teams and monitor to make sure that, it doesn't get worse. Again, this is how you can do it. You want to look for people who are opportunistic, people that cope with negative events in a positive way. They can change, they're flexible, and a big one that people don't realize is somebody that's able to ignore something at that time, like something really stressful or something really negative, and just get something done and then come back to it after, is actually really positive for something that is, I keep saying something, for highly stressful environments, because you can't focus on everything all the time. You have to be able to prioritize. Basically, you want to know who your teams are, how they learn, how they think, but also, most importantly, how they react. I'm almost done. So to recap, this is what you learned today. You learned how to support your users to learn new skills, such as giving them time, allowing them to recover, and allowing them to be motivated and supporting them. You've learned how to incorporate a variety of learning methods. Think of, how does this person learn? How can I build the syllabus around that? And a variety of ones, because, you're going to hire different people, not everyone in your own image. And so you do that effectively. You looked at intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and you understood what does success look like for your business before you actually try and solve it. Considering the budget and continuous measurements. And the last and most important thing is understand your people, monitor, and actually care about them. Because if you don't, I don't know, I'll stalk you. Bad. That is everything. Anybody have questions? Yeah?
You talked earlier about reinforcing something, and because I'm old, I think of that as muscle memory.
Yeah.
But also, later on, you talked about language,
yeah,
and how talking the business language. Something that I started doing recently is, rather than referring to people as users, or to people we work with as users,
yeah,
I start in my own head talking about them as colleagues.
Yeah.
Because that removes the negative
for sure,
in my
yeah.
head. Do you think that's helpful? So to think about our own language and how we think about communicating generally?
Definitely. So the question was, if you change how you think about other people and how you, like, instead of saying users, calling them colleagues, is that going to make a difference? Yes, that's going to be a huge difference. Language is very strong. When I was going through the whole domestic abuse, survivor and victim, simply changing it from you're a victim to you're a survivor does actually make you feel stronger. If you call people, oh, you're just a user, you're being condescending by default. You're saying, like, in your mind, you're saying, wow, they're not quite as smart as I am, but they're just differently skilled. So changing your perception of how you view your colleagues is highly effective, because it's like, think of it in war. People can't hurt people, but they can if they dehumanize them, make them less than human, less than you. Cybersecurity, cyber warfare. Don't call them users, call them colleagues, call them, skilled people that are intelligent but have to learn these skills specifically. So yes, I think it's highly effective. I would also say muscle memory is actually, when I talked about the hard-coded, it's actually not your muscles that are remembering it. It's your brain, the physical hardware, and actually your spinal cord. I do that, but it's actually in back, but that's okay. It's not actually your muscles memorizing it. It's, I don't know. For me, that I like to correct those things. But yes, I think changing the way you perceive your colleagues and even just down to how you think does make a difference. Do you want a prize? I've got a few. Come on. I like to motivate. See, in extrinsic motivation, I even have a little, Guinness patch. I came from Dublin.
I'll do a choose kindness thing.
Yeah, that one's lovely.
Message, I think.
Yeah, it's basically a book that every day you write something positive that you've done, and it reminds you, and it changes the way you perceive the world. It's brilliant. Any other questions? I mean, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other prizes. Yeah?
Talked about culture and having diverse teams.
Yeah.
How would you help an organisation that had a toxic culture change? Have you got any tips?
Yeah, so the question was, how do you change culture? How do you go from having a very toxic environment to a very positive environment? There's a lot of different things that you can do. One thing that's worked for me is hiring the right head of. The person that's actually going to make the biggest impact is not necessarily the partner, but it's the leader, the person that actually works directly with the teams and changing the way they think, like the way they think of users, the way they think of each other. Team building exercises, whilst sound really cheesy, are actually really beneficial. We need to actually feel a connection to our team to work effectively with them. We need to build our trust with our colleagues to be like, I trust you to do your work. I trust you to succeed. I trust you to be able to hand off my work to you and it actually to get done. I think that the biggest thing is not trying to change culture itself altogether right away. It's to change small behaviors as it happens. If you haven't noticed, I am female, and I've short hair, but I'm still female. I've found in security, sometimes it can be quite negative. I interviewed at a place many years ago, and they told me, oh, we don't hire women because they're distracting to men. I told them to stop hiring little boys, but that to me, obviously that's very toxic, and you're not going to change that culture because that's the owner of the business. But if that happened in your environment, for example, and you had the authority to change that, or, you had the strength to be able to say, actually, that's wrong, and changing little things like that as they happen can actually make a difference. Making sure people feel supported. So if you know Dr. Jessica Barker on Twitter, she's bloody brilliant. But one thing she said is she had a awareness program that she was implementing at this organization. And this woman came into her training and said, I'm really embarrassed. I'm the worst person for your training because I caused a breach. It was really awful. It took a really long time to get past it. So I'm the worst person to be here. And Jessica said, actually, you're the best. You're the best person because you've been in that situation. You have the personal, real life experience. You know, beginning to end, how to deal with it. And it was actually changing it from her coming in with a ton of shame, embarrassment, anxiety, to Jessica being like, no, you know what you're doing. You're good. You're experienced. This is positive, and adding a positive spin to it, so that people feel more motivated. That also helps. I created this awareness program that teaches non-technical people how to hack so that they can better understand. I'm not building a mini hacker army. I'm teaching people like foundational skills, like how to use the social engineering toolkit, like press number 1, press number 2, like very basic. But it's just demystifying the hackers, and it's really positive and had big change in culture because it took away the anxiety of the unknown. It took away the negative and reset everyone on the same page and got them really excited because they got to talk about the sexy parts of security in a safe environment to ask questions. If that answers your question? Yeah, lovely. Want a prize? Come.
I'll get one.
Okay. Way back there.
Right, yeah.
I'm not gonna...
Talking to the board, how do you create that kind of authority so that they will take on board what you're saying to them?
Oh, I get my workout for today. So the question was, when you're talking to the board, how do you create that authority? So the first thing is, if you're the one talking to the board and you don't have that authority, then maybe you're not at the right place. Not because they don't trust you, but because if your job title means you're supposed to be making the budget and they're supposed to be approving it, and they are like, actually, we don't give a shit what you say, then anything you do is probably going to be negative. But, if you're in that and you need to build the trust, like I said earlier, of creating those dashboards, creating that background information and speaking their language, per se, saying like, this is why I need this budget, These are the things that we've fallen victim to in the past. These are the trends in industry. These are the things that are in our sector are highly important. These are the regulatory standards. If you want to talk to the board and get money quickly, talk about GDPR. It's brilliant. Or if they're in the industrial control systems or like critical infrastructure, talk about the NIS directive. Also brilliant. Maybe not as publicized, but basically it's Network Information Systems Directive. It's talking about security for critical infrastructure. Also important, also has a lot of fees if you fail. Incorporating things like, these are examples that you see in the news. These are examples that actually happen for you. And this is ways that we can make a change. Building that trust that you know what you're talking about actually will make it easier later because they trust that you, one, know what you're talking about, and two, actually are paying attention. Another thing I like to do is focusing on the personal side. So when I do awareness training at really, really, really challenging places that nobody really wants to care, I incorporate pizza because everybody likes pizza. But also I talk about personal security, how to protect you, how to protect your children and maybe your friends or family. Because when people are, it's personal, they listen more. And I talk about stories because humans are emotionally invested in stories. And so maybe it's a big thing happening in the news or something they've been through, they'll actually follow that story more closely and be more positively impacted, or negatively, I guess, because they're going to pay more attention. And so building that trust doesn't necessarily mean coming in being like, I have all these certifications. They actually need to trust that you know what you're talking about and they can relate to it. And again, speak their language, etc., etc. I mean, I don't like to say fear-mongering, but an interesting thing is if somebody's scared, yes, they shut down. But if you're going through an incident and there's a lot of adrenaline in it, like you're anxious, your brain actually takes more details. It's why we think a situation is going in slow motion, is because we're taking in more details than we actually are used to, and our brain thinks, well, it must be happening very slowly. So it's not slow motion at the time, but the way we remember it is, kind of. So, I mean, if you have an incident, that's a great way to walk them through it, because they'll be anxious, and then maybe they'll retain more. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah? Okay, cool. Okay, I've got 3 more presents. Yeah?
You keep talking about how business people and IT people should be expected IT people to meet the language of business. But do you think it should always be like that, or should business be expected to meet certain IT language?
So the question is, do I think that it should be expected that tech should always have to be able to translate to the business language and not backwards, or like business talking tech? I think in the beginning, to get them interested in it, you kind of have to. It's a bit unfair of a requirement for them. But over time, what you'll find is as they build trust and as they kind of understand it and you've taken away that negativity, they'll actually start to understand more about security in the first place. In the ideal world, I should be able to go to my tech or my exec and be like, you know, this is the situation, these are the controls I want, these are what I want, blah, 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 blah. And whilst I'm incorporating risk, I'm also talking tech stuff. Yeah, that'd be lovely. Whether that will happen, I don't know. But you do have to remember, when you're building a security solution, you're going to have to take a risk-based approach anyway, because at the end of the day, budgets are not infinite, whatever the word, they do end. And so you need to prioritize certain things anyway. So you just kind of have to think in a risk-based approach to begin with. I think in the beginning it can be a little bit unfair, like a one-sided relationship. Don't break up with them right away. Kind of support them into learning how to speak to you effectively and how you can speak to them effectively. Because it should be both ways, definitely. But it might not be in the beginning, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so now I have 2 more prizes. Are we at time?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, you have 30 seconds.
All right, really quick. In the line of positivity, a lot of times in Intrinsic, especially in managing policies, thick and carrot.
Yeah.
How do you incentivize people to follow security policies without trying to polish them?
Okay, so I said in security, there's a lot more stick than carrot. There's a lot of more punishments than rewards. Going back to that program I built, I like to use gamification principles. I like to motivate people to be motivated. So extrinsic motivation, great for short term. You know, giving them prizes, giving them like, I'm basically extrinsically motivating you guys to ask questions. But for long term, it's actually intrinsic. So, people will be motivated long term because they feel like their sense of mastery, they feel like they're learning something, blah, blah, blah. So, I think to remove the negative stigma of, you know, cybersecurity is just negative. You need to create a safe culture, like I said. Short-term motivations with pizza, money, beer. Be careful though. I had an awareness program where I had beer and pizza, and they drank a bit too much where the security team was answering the wrong questions, and it was a bit embarrassing for me, but be mindful of that. Yeah, just kind of resetting the mindset of security is going to make a difference, and making sure your policies address that. So I'm not going to name names, but there is a Big Four that said, if you don't submit your timesheets on time, it costs you 100 quid. That to me is horrendous. And I disagree with it. Maybe it works for them. That's fine. I don't know the situation, but kind of incorporating the culture, but also the policies and regulations and the requirements to actually support that positivity is going to make a difference. Having the top-down support and the bottom-up. Another thing I did in that awareness program is I said it's not required to attend. I didn't actually say you had to come. I didn't ever make it required. It was just a point system. If you did come, you get achievements until you became a cyber warrior. Who doesn't want to be a cyber warrior? and it actually had people anywhere from paralegals to partners coming, and because people saw the partners coming, and because the partners saw the paralegals coming, there was the perception that it was cool, and I actually it became hugely beneficial because people wanted to come, they weren't required to come. Does that make sense? I think that's all I'm allowed. Okay. I'm glad my computer came back. Thank you for having me.